In a short period of time following its reveal to the world in 2020, the Callisto Protocol had developed a bit of a story around itself, specifically relating to its director, Glen Schofield, who was the executive producer and co-creator of the original Dead Space. When the announcement trailer was shown off, it was pretty clear what the game was aiming to be: the big spiritual successor to EA's long-dormant space horror franchise, straight from the mind from one of the guys who made it. From day one, the Callisto Protocol had a lot of support behind it. Fans of sci-fi and horror were totally ready for more Dead Space, even if it was in a different but vaguely similar package. Schofield in particular had been vocal about his pride in the game, going so far as to get it detached from the PUBG universe, as it was originally intended to be set inside of it, just far into the future. He was able to rip those chains away and confirm that Callisto Protocol was now an entirely new IP with no relation to PUBG whatsoever, making the game more or less truly and completely his and Striking Distance's own. But Glen isn't the only person in striking distance from the old Visceral team. According to him, there's about 25 to 30 people formerly of Visceral and Sledgehammer working on the Callisto Protocol, including producer Steve Papoutsis, designer Scott Whitney, and animation director Christopher Stone. With a tested and capable team and a wide range of supporting fans, Glen and Striking Distance seemed to be totally set up to succeed, especially with marketing and promotional footage looking crisp and gorgeous. So how is the Callisto Protocol? Did it hit a home run, or did Striking Distance strike out? Well, I played the game, I finished it, and here are my thoughts. The Callisto Protocol takes place in the distant future of 2320, where mankind has finally taken to the stars for long-term colonization of distant planetary bodies, including the moons of Jupiter, Europa, and of course, Callisto. Freight transporter Jacob Lee, played by Josh Duhamel, has recently been shipping suspicious, volatile, and unlabeled cargo between Europa and the massive super penitentiary on Callisto, Black Iron Prison, which is owned by the hyper-wealthy United Jupiter Company. Unfortunately, Jacob's ship is boarded by suspected terrorists called the Outer Way, and he crash lands on the surface of Callisto, only a short distance from Black Iron. He and the Outer Way leader, Danny Nakamura, played by Karen Fukuhara, are the only survivors. And in an unlucky twist of fate, Jacob is arrested and imprisoned alongside Danny. Jacob has a device brutally installed into the back of his neck, his head shaved, and he's thrown into his cell where he loses consciousness and awakes in time to see the entire prison under attack from infected inmates and staff who have transformed into horrific zombie-like creatures called the biophage. Now he seeks to escape the chaos and possibly find the source of the infection. To be totally upfront, the Callisto Protocol's story, while there and holding some very interesting world-building potential, really is not a centerpiece of the experience. It has your typical survival horror supplemental material within the game, such as audio logs and the like, and they can add a bit more flavor to the setting and characterization of the cast, but it's entirely up to the player to decide if they're worth a break to listen to. None of it is mandatory or even all that important. Speaking of the game's cast, though, it consists mostly of familiar Hollywood faces, including Duhamel, Fukuhara, and Sam Witwer as Captain Ferris, and they do deliver some pretty great performances, despite the script not really giving them particularly challenging material. Striking Distance utilized some really impressive motion and facial capturing technology for the game, and the result is quite possibly the best looking character models I've seen in a game so far. Seriously, in some scenes with the right lighting and the right angle, you can take a screenshot and it would look deceptively realistic, bordering on indistinguishable from a real set and costumes. It's jaw-dropping, honestly. And with that, let's swerve into talking about graphics and performance. I played the game on PlayStation 5, and just like the character models, environments are remarkable. Every room, every hallway, every vista is packed with so many assets and detail that it almost feels like a miracle the game runs at a solid frame rate at all. The ray tracing featured in the game's quality mode is also very robust, displaying reflections and bounced lighting off a bunch of shiny surfaces, and it really adds to the atmosphere, especially in those hallways and smaller rooms. Furthermore, the frame rate for quality mode was a surprisingly consistent 30, with only rare noticeable drops during the busiest of sequences. I tried performance mode for a bit, and while the game still looks very good, I ultimately went back to quality mode because I felt the ray-traced lighting and shadows just added so much. Either way, you can't really go wrong with whichever you pick, because Callisto Protocol is gorgeous from all angles. Loading times are blazing fast, as I've grown to expect on this console, but am still surprised by. Depending on the context of the load, you'll be waiting as little as 2 seconds and as much as 6. Really impressive for a game that's this beautiful and stuffed with so much detail. Then we have sound. Arguably the biggest contributor to any horror game's atmosphere and tension is the audio design and mixing, and I'm pleased to report that it's about as robust as any other in Callisto Protocol. Environmental and ambient sound is plentiful, and in some cases can make you paranoid because you anticipate an enemy popping out of the walls any second, as you can hear them inside the vents, and it stays largely consistent throughout the whole game. Sound effects when fighting enemies are also appropriately grotesque and crunchy, and gunshots sound loud and oppressive. Machinery sounds believable and suitably futuristic, and dialogue is very clear. The game not only boasts remarkable visuals, but fantastic audio too. Also worth noting is the game's accessibility options, which are markedly extensive, offering subtitle customization, dyslexia font for said subtitles, colorblindness and sight-impaired options, and easier mechanics like easier QTEs and easier dodging. Honestly, if you hate QTEs just on principle, I recommend turning easier QTEs on, because your triangle button will be getting beat the fuck up otherwise. Everything regarding the Callisto Protocol's production value is extremely high level. It looks great, sounds great, and is very accessible. And that's all well and good. But what about the gameplay? The meat and potatoes of the experience? To be totally frank, this game is not survival horror. If you're wondering what my definition of survival horror is, well, I already made a 40-minute video detailing that, and I recommend checking it out if you're interested. The link is in the description. So what makes the Callisto Protocol not survival horror? Well, let's go over it part by part. First is map design. Aside from the game's environments being awe-striking and asset-filled, there's little else to praise. Levels are extremely linear, more so than Dead Space's were. The game is basically a hallway. Progress is one direction only, and while there might be rare instances of diverging paths, one leads to extra items and credits only to loop back around to the progression path anyway. But frustratingly, these optional paths are not marked. You have to guess which is which. This will be annoying for people trying to 100% the game and get all collectibles, but thankfully, all the really important stuff, like new weapons, are all on the progression path anyway. What's worse is that the game is so linear that oftentimes you enter a new area to start a new chapter of the story, so to speak, and the door you just exited from is locked behind you for no reason. There's a horrible lack of interconnectivity within this world. True survival horror games feature a Metroidvania-like layout where you're constantly going back and forth between new and previously visited areas because you got a key to unlock a door you saw hours ago, which may or may not lead to progress. There's nothing like that in the Callisto Protocol at all. It doesn't feel like one large connected space like the Spencer Mansion, RPD, or even the USG Ishimura, which was still quite linear by genre standards. Here, Black Iron Prison feels like a series of clearly bordered off levels, and I feel no attachment to any of them. I'm surprised the game doesn't have a chapter select because it feels like it was designed with one in mind. Relating to map design in survival horror is the presence of puzzles. The Callisto Protocol has none. At all. At most, you'll be searching for a key card or some gate fuses to take and put somewhere else to open another door, but that's about as far as it goes. Aside from sometimes trying to deduce which path leads to progress and which leads to items on the occasion you see a fork in the road, there's nothing else that requires any brain power while walking forward through the corridor that is Black Iron Prison. I would have loved to see puzzles scattered around at a regular pace to break up the monotony of fighting. I would have gladly traded about 20% of all the fights in the game for some good puzzles, because that's the least amount of fights you could throw out and still not experience anything new regarding combat. And that is our next topic, combat. Let me start off by saying that the combat in the Callisto Protocol is extremely visceral. Whether you blast an enemy with one of your guns or bash it in the head with your baton, it feels chunky and heavy. It can feel immensely satisfying and like you're really doing a ton of damage even though you really aren't. It's gory, up close and personal, and almost animalistic. And that's about all the good I have to say about combat in this game. Much to my surprise, the Callisto Protocol is significantly more melee focused than I thought it would be. It seems to be a deliberate design choice to make it impossible to be able to do a gun-only playthrough because ammo is scarce and enemies are weirdly spongy with bullets. So there will be a heavy reliance on the stun baton. Thus, a gigantic portion of the action will be taking place within arm's reach of the enemy, effectively turning this game into a brawler or beat 'em up. I will say that the Callisto Protocol does set up a good foundation for its combat. It does something that's pretty new as far as horror games go, and I can respect that. The problem is, it never goes beyond that, a foundation. For the entirety of the game's runtime, there was no meaningful evolution of the combat, either up close or at range, even after unlocking and upgrading weapons. The general combat loop is to just dodge up to 4 times in a row, then counter with a melee combo, shoot a weak point, and repeat until the enemy is dead. It's like I was playing a sci-fi horror version of Sekiro, but worse. And it stays that way the entire time. The only other option is to abuse the laughably overpowered grip, which is a telekinetic glove that lets you pick up enemies and throw them into environmental hazards for instant kills. This becomes a very important tool in fights with multiple enemies because it's the only thing that makes those encounters bearable. There's very little in the way of player expression to be found here. It's basically assured that everyone who plays the game will play almost the exact same way, because bashing enemies with the baton is so important and ammunition is so scarce. I've seen some footage floating around of people trying to make the combat look cooler and more stylish than it actually is, but it always just looks messy and impractical, especially when the footage is just wasting a bunch of grip in a one-on-one fight, which are already ridiculously easy. There are a couple of enemy types where you can and should start off the encounter with your guns, such as the guy who shoots projectiles from afar, and the little exploding assholes who explode when they reach you. But aside from those contexts, fights will primarily be melee-centric. And speaking of enemy types, the variety here is honestly pretty pathetic. It's just a few variations of the same regular trash mobs, then those projectile spitting guys who simply become a trash mob once you shoot them in the head to disable their projectiles, then a blind enemy type you can sneak past but is still mechanically indistinguishable from the ones I just mentioned, and then those little exploding jerks, a 4-legged creature that can turn invisible, and a mini-boss you fight 4 times because it's the only mini-boss in the game. There's somewhat of an attempt to add a superficial level of enemy variety by adding an evolution mechanic where they transform and become stronger mid-fight, but it just beefs up their health and damage. Otherwise, they're still the same enemy after the transformation. And then you have QTE enemies, the weird tentacle head that pops out of a little flesh sack and the little grub things that jump out of chests and lockers to latch onto you. They're just there for QTEs and jump scares, nothing more. They're closer to an environmental hazard than they are to a real enemy. There's some pretty annoying sequences where you encounter like 6 of them in a row. Why? The only non-biophage enemy of note is optional patrol robots who give an expensive sellable item if you kill them. They're pretty cool, but there's only 3 or 4 of them in total. And then there's the dodge mechanic, which has been getting a lot of discussion since the game's release. You've probably already heard it explained a ton of times, but in case you're not aware, I'll do it myself. The dodge in Callisto Protocol is actually very easy to do. All you have to do is hold left or right on your analog stick, and Jacob will automatically dodge in that direction when an enemy attacks. You do not have to dodge in a specific direction. You can dodge either left or right. The only rule to dodging is that you have to alternate between directions when dodging successive attacks. Meaning, if an enemy attacks 2 times, then you must dodge left, right, or vice versa. If they attack 3 times, then you dodge left, right, left, or vice versa. That's it. It's very easy to pull off mechanically. You can also block by holding back on the analog stick while the attack is happening. So, what's the problem with it? The answer is simple: reliability. It works perfectly in one-on-one fights, but as more enemies join in, you have to keep them all on screen somehow, or it becomes less reliable until it's borderline useless, because you cannot reliably dodge attacks coming from behind, because dodging is contextual to your position in relation to the enemy and their attack animation. It would have been really fucking great if this game had a quick turn. This is the fundamental failure of Callisto Protocol's dodge mechanic. It takes away the ability to dodge in any direction whenever you want. Any other action game with a good dodge lets you press the dodge button and any direction you wish to dodge in that direction, without needing to wait for the enemy to begin their attack animation. This allows you to consistently avoid any and all attacks from any direction, whether they're behind you, in front of you, on screen, or off screen. Callisto Protocol's dodge enforces contextual dodging so that it only reliably functions when you're actually facing the enemy and when the enemy begins an attack animation. If a dodge mechanic has rules, then those rules should be intuitively inferred, if not outright explained. This is why the grip is so important. It's the only resource that prevents multi-enemy encounters from giving you a fucking migraine, because you can just delete entire fights by grabbing enemies and throwing them into spikes or blades. Sadly, even the grip is weirdly unreliable at times because it feels like the game decides whether it wants to let you throw enemies 10 feet or 10 inches. And if you throw enemies into spikes at too much of an angle, they'll just slide off and you have to annoyingly waste more grip meter to throw them again. Still, when it works well. But if there isn't any environmental hazards to take advantage of in a multi-enemy fight, well, good luck then, I guess. You normally can't run away from fights either. Seriously, enemies are faster than Jacob and oftentimes you have to beat them in order to progress. I successfully ran away from 2 fights, and that's only because I shoved Jacob into a crawl space because enemies have no way of pulling him back out. They're just not designed to do that. The combination of the low enemy variety, dodge mechanics unreliability, and the lackluster player expression in offense is what makes the combat portion of the game so repetitious and boring. There's also the fact that animations are obscenely long. It takes an eternity to reload and switch weapons, and healing mid-fight is impossible. Genuinely. Jacob has to kneel down on one knee for some fucking reason and slowly inject himself with health goo. It's about a 10-second long animation, and enemies are too aggressive to allow this animation to complete unless they're stuck on geometry or something, or just really far away. Again, I can respect that Striking Distance tried to make a different approach to combat in this game. They succeeded in making the combat at least look cool, and they laid a solid mechanical foundation, but they never capitalized on it beyond that. When this game was first announced, I sincerely never would have guessed I'd be bashing enemies with a baton this much, and sadly I do not mesh with it. I mentioned earlier that I would gladly trade at least 20% of the game's fights with puzzles, and this is why. I want to fight less, and that's not a good sign. And the real tragedy here is that despite all my grumbling, I can tell that this game will be a lot more fun on a New Game Plus playthrough, so I can run around with fully upgraded weapons from the start. If only the game launched with New Game Plus instead of putting it in an update we won't receive until February, after the Dead Space remake is out. Great. And the final question some people may have is the game at least scary? I am sad to say that I felt not even the slightest tingle of fear throughout my entire playthrough. For a game that has such good atmosphere and many jump scares, I was never startled a single time. I was confused as to why that was until I was a few hours into the game and it hit me. It's because I have no reason to be scared of anything. In most other horror games, being within arm's reach of the enemy is where you don't want to be. You want distance between yourself and the creature or zombie you're aiming at, because arm's length distance is where they do the most damage. Sometimes it spells instant doom. But in Callisto Protocol, that's where you want to be because that's where you do the most damage. There's no real sense of fear when I know that nothing bad will automatically happen to me when I get into an enemy's face. It's not like my baton has durability, and it's not like I can't easily dodge. I don't have to be careful when walking or running forward. There's no reason to. Anything that pops out of the vents, I can just beat the shit out of. The reason why the Regenerators are the scariest enemy in Resident Evil 4 is because they're the only enemy you want to stay away from, no matter how good at the game you are. I ran through Callisto Protocol with no hesitance in my step. If I was walking around slowly, it's not because I was cautious, it's because I was just admiring the view or my environment. It also doesn't help that the first hour of the game is jammed with so many jump scare attempts that I quickly built up a tolerance to it. Especially when many of them have an associated sound effect you can detect before the scare actually happens. It's all just an unfortunate side effect of the melee-focused combat. Overall, the Callisto Protocol has a ton of potential, and that's extremely easy to see, which is why I can understand people still loving it. But I feel that the game does little to fully grasp and utilize that potential once you look below the surface. It's just not worth the $70 price tag currently attached to it. It's a marvel to look at and listen to, and the universe shows a ton of promise. But it quickly falls apart once I actually start to play and realize that there's little there. The characters are well acted, but lack depth. The combat has a good foundation, but doesn't evolve. The environments are gorgeous, but the map is basically a hallway. And it's just not scary. I've seen a few comparisons calling the game this generation's The Order 1886, and that's surprisingly apt. Both games had a horror slant, both games had cool settings and cool ideas, both games had remarkable production value, and both games were linear as hell, mechanically shallow, and sometimes frustrating. And remember, I played this on the PlayStation 5, which is apparently the best platform to play on. If I were on PC, I would have a plethora of technical problems to talk about too. The Callisto Protocol is the kind of new IP that starts out rocky but could get a really fucking good sequel if Striking Distance listens to feedback. Give us a more open map that has real exploration. Give us puzzles so we don't burn out on combat. Give us combat that offers room to use guns more liberally. Give us a real dodge. The door is open for a follow-up that could really live up to the hype the first game had, and I hope Striking Distance is given the opportunity to walk through. As unlikely as it is, I can only hope that the game gets some small but meaningful tweaks over the next month and a half. I don't want Callisto Protocol's thunder to be stolen away, but if the Dead Space remake comes out and is the game that offers the experience that everyone wanted Callisto to be, then that's going to be a huge hit against it. And even a New Game Plus update won't save it. Either way, if you want an actual survival horror game for 2022, I recommend checking out Signalis. I haven't played it yet personally, but I've heard many great things, and it's on my to-do list before I do a top 5 of 2022. Alternatively, if you want a AAA survival horror game, then just wait for the remakes of Dead Space or Resident Evil 4. They are closing in, and I'm really eager for them. This concludes my review of the Callisto Protocol. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you around.